the hot summer of 1983 and the Cold War rages. Ronald Reagan is U.S. President. Michael Jackson's Thriller is at the top of the charts, and Pac-Man is all the rage. Threat of nuclear war looms large, and intense suspicion fills the air. This almost comic juxtaposition of pop and politics formed the backdrop against which Korean Airlines Flight 7 took to the skies above New York on August 31st. None of the almost 300 people on board knew that an incredible series of events was about to unfold on their flight, which would bring the world to the brink of war. This is the incredible story of Korean Airlines Flight 7. In the middle of the night on August 31st, 1983, a Korean Airlines Boeing 747 stopped over to refuel at Anchorage in Alaska. It was traveling from New York to Seoul in South Korea. As Flight 007 on board were 246 passengers and 23 crew. Most of the passengers were Koreans heading home, though there were also a few dozen U.S. citizens, as well as several Japanese and Taiwanese nationals, and people from 8 other countries. Many of the passengers were transiting through South Korea. On their way to their home countries, opened the front of the massive plane. The flight crew began preparing the aircraft for its 8-hour trans-Pacific voyage. In command of the flight was 45-year-old Captain Chung Bung-in Chon, was an ex-Korean Air Force pilot, and after decades of flying, he had built up over 10,000 hours of flying, experience more than 6,000 of which were on the 747. He had been flying this particular route for the past 5 years, and he knew it very well. He was joined in the cockpit by 47-year-old First Officer Sun Dang-hee. Like the captain's son had previously flown for the Korean Air Force, he had joined Korean Airlines 4 years previously, and like the captain, he was highly experienced, having accumulated just short of 9,000 hours flying time. Sitting behind the pilots at the flight engineer station was 31-year-old Kim E-dong. Kim had joined Korean Airlines in 1977, and in this time had accumulated 4,000 hours of flying time, over 2,500 of which were on the 747. On this note, the plane's route would take it over the world's largest ocean, on the northernmost of 5 predefined no-pax or North Pacific routes. This route was known as Romeo 210, and it was favored by airlines because it provided the shortest oceanic crossing. The route contained 10 waypoints, most of which corresponded not to beacons on the ground, but to latitude and longitude coordinates, which the pilots programmed into the plane's onboard computer, known as the INS or Inertial Navigation System. This computer will play a crucial role as the flight progresses to load their route into the INS. One pilot read out each coordinate from the printed copy of the flight plan, while the other entered them into the Inertial Navigation System. On this flight, the pilots had to take extra care when entering these coordinates into their computers. While the Romeo 2 nil route was the shortest path across the Pacific, it came within 32 kilometers of Soviet-restricted airspace in 1983. Cold War. Tensions had reached level of intensity not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 decades previously. The Soviets were on high alert for enemy intruders into their airspace, and they had shown little restraint in shooting infringing aircraft. The pilots of Flight 7 were well aware of this, but some would later speculate that as they entered these waypoints on the ground, they made a grave error. We'll explore this possibility in a moment. At 10 minutes before that morning, Flight 7 and its 269 passengers and crew pushed back from the gate at Anchorage. They were right on schedule to arrive in Seoul in just under 8 hours at 6 a.m. local time. After a short taxi to runway 32, the pilots lined up and received takeoff clearance at 5 a.m. that morning. They pushed the plane's 4 massive engines to take off power and began thundering down the runway seconds after takeoff. Anchorage Air Traffic Control asked the pilots to turn left onto a compass heading of 220 degrees, or roughly southwest. This was to put them on course towards their flight plan route. The pilots began this slow turn to the left as they climbed out over the Alaskan wilderness. But just as they leveled the wings a few moments later, the controller gave them another instruction. He now asked them to fly directly to the Bethel waypoint, a radio beacon 600 kilometers to the west. This was a shortcut for the pilots, as Bethel was the second waypoint on their flight plan. By going straight there, they could bypass the Cairn Mountain radio beacon, which was their first waypoint. The only problem was that at a distance of 600 kilometers, The battle beacon was out of range of their navigation radios, so instead of tuning the frequency of this beacon into the radios, they engaged the autopilot and turned the heading select knob to a heading of about 245 degrees. This would put them roughly on course for the beacon. Their plan was that once they got closer, they could switch the autopilot from heading select mode to nav mode. The difference between these two modes would play a critical role in the events to follow in nav mode. The plane automatically follows the route, which the pilots program into it. Each time the plane reaches a new waypoint, it turns towards the next one and continues all the way until the last waypoint on the route. This automatic route following reduces the workload of the pilots as it allows them to simply sit back and monitor the progress of the flight rather than constantly changing headings manually as they reach new waypoints. By contrast, in heading mode, the plane doesn't follow a route, but rather it stays on a compass heading, which the pilots select on the autopilot. This mode is never used for entire flights, but rather it's a temporary method used to steer the plane away from weather or to navigate closer to airports on landing. A pilot can simply select the heading they desire for as long as they need it, and then turn the plane back on course, when in this example, they have passed the weather. Once back on course, they re-engage nav mode, and the plane continues along the original route. Within a few moments, the pilots were on a heading of 245 degrees and were climbing to their initial cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. Most of the passengers were still asleep in New York, where the flight had originally departed from. The local time was now just past 7 a.m. before Long Flight 7 was passing by the Karen Mountain radio beacon, which was originally the first waypoint on the flight plan. At this point, Anchorage Air Traffic Control told the pilots to contact the next controller along the route they made contact, and the controller asked them to report passing Bethel, the final land-based waypoint on the transoceanic route. As far as the pilots were concerned, all was going smoothly on long flights with little to do but make the odd position report to air traffic control. The cockpit takes on a comfortable, almost cocoon-like quality, the warm lighting of the instruments and cases. The pilots, while the white noise of the cold air outside rushes by the cockpit. Ahead of the pilots lay 7 hours of smooth sailing. About 10 minutes behind them, another Korean Airlines Flight 15 was on its way from Anchorage to Seoul. On the same route, the two crews would be able to keep each other company over the radio as they made their way out over the Pacific. But despite appearances, these two jets would have entirely different experiences as they set out across the ocean. As the minutes passed, they began to resemble each other less and less. Almost an hour after takeoff, and cruising at 31,000 feet, Flight 7 neared the battle radio beacon, as this was the last land-based beacon on the flight path before the pilot set out over the ocean. It was vitally important that they used it to check that their navigation equipment was accurate. Every waypoint after this was just a kind of virtual waypoint, a set of latitude and longitude coordinates which were contained within the plane's fully internal navigation computers. This meant that the Bethel waypoint served as a kind of umbilical cord, connecting the plane to Mother Earth before it set out over the ocean. By its own lights, it wasn't just commonsensical to check their position at Bethel. Either it was company policy at Korean Airlines, and it was the procedure outlined by Boeing in their flight manuals. But for some reason, when the pilots passed the battle beacon, they appeared not to notice that they were actually 12 nautical miles to the north of it. A little bit of navigational inaccuracy was expected back in 1983, but after just 1 hour of flight, the plane should not have been more than 2 nautical miles off course, and yet here it was, a full 12 miles north of where it should have been. Nonetheless, the pilots told air traffic control that they were at battle, and they continued their journey west. So already barely an hour into the flight, things had started to go wrong, and already there are 2 things which we need to explain. The first of these is why the plane was off course to begin with. If you think back to those 2 autopilot modes, nav and heading select, then an obvious candidate appears. Could it be that the pilots simply forgot to put the autopilot in nav mode as the plane neared the beacon? If this was the case, then rather than snapping back onto the flight pound route, the plane would simply continue on a heading of 245 degrees, where the pilots had left. It didn't hit battle, and it wouldn't hit any other waypoints after it. The plane was now on a long, straight road to nowhere. Pilots have made this mistake before, and the design of the 747 cockpit makes it a difficult mistake to notice, unlike in modern aircraft, there was no annunciator light to tell the pilots that they were in heading mode. So, at least for now, we'll go with this explanation that the pilots forgot to put the INS into nav mode because it fits all of the available facts. That doesn't mean that new facts won't emerge as the fight progresses. It's one thing to end up, of course, but it's another thing altogether, not to notice it. So the second thing that needs explaining is why the pilots didn't seem to notice that. They had straight off course. It seems almost unthinkable that sheer neglect could cause all 3 flight crew members to miss this important position. Check at Bethel. While something else at play, this question will become an increasing focus of this story as the plane continues its journey out over the Pacific. In 41 minutes, the plane would reach its next waypoint called. Maybe once here, the crew would have another chance to check their position against their flight plan. As Flight 7 continued. Out west, a whole other sort of operation was being conducted a few hundred miles ahead, on the Soviet peninsula of Kamchatka. The USSR was planning a series of missile tests which would commence later that day on September 1st. Because of this, the Soviets were on high alert. They were carefully monitoring the airspace around the peninsula, keeping a close eye out for spy planes, and as it turned out, their paranoia was well-founded. Just to the east of Kamchatka, a United States or C-135 was circling. This 4-engined military jet was part of a covert mission sent to gather intelligence on the upcoming missile. Its exterior lights were all turned off, and it was slowly, cautiously gathering information on Soviet activities on the ground. The personnel inside were listening to Soviet radio communications and scanning the ground to try to understand the capabilities of their enemy. But it wasn't long before the Soviets caught sight of the plane on radar. Meanwhile, Flight 7 had reached its next waypoint, Navy. The pilots now had another chance to notice the discrepancy between the route and their flight plan and the actual path they were taking by this point. There were now 60 nautical miles north of their intended course, or about 110 kilometers. This discrepancy between their actual route and their planned route would have appeared on their INS, but for some reason at 32 minutes past 6 in the morning. Alaska time, the pilots of Flight 7 told air traffic control that they had passed Navy. And this is where another oddity about this flight rears its head. When the pilots radioed Anchorage to tell them that they had passed Navy, they heard nothing but static on the other end of the line, but apparently without much thought as to why this could be. The crew of Flight 7 asked their colleagues in Flight 15 to relay their message to the controller. They managed to do this without issue, even though they were supposedly just 10 minutes behind Flight 7. This relay was set up, and from here on all messages between Flight 7 and Anchorage would be relayed through Flight 15. Of course, in reality, the reason that the crew couldn't get through to Anchorage was that they were simply out of radio range. Radio communications over long distances are never that reliable to begin with. So the fact that they were having trouble talking to Anchorage wasn't an immediate cause for concern for the pilots. However, when we couple this with another strange fact, we have to begin to wonder if there is some other explanation for the pilots' apparent nonchalance. 140 nautical miles to the south of Navy on the small island of St. Paul, there was a radio beacon as part of Korean Airlines procedures for aircraft flying. This route, pilots had to check that they could pick up this beacon as they passed Navy. This was another easy way for the crew to ensure that they were on track. Have a look at this map from the ICAO's report into this incident in 1993. Shows the beacon here and its range as this ring here is the flight plan route for Flight 7. And here is the plane's actual route. As you can see, if the pilots had been on track, they would easily have been in range of the beacon. But because they were well north of their intended track, there was no way they could pick up a signal. So we're left with a question. Did the crew even try to pick up the beacon after all? They were supposed to, according to Korean Airlines policy. If they did try and they didn't get any signal from it, then they would have concluded either that they were off course or that the beacon was not operational. If they figured that the beacon was not operational, They would have contacted air traffic control, or at least the other Korean Airlines crew to ask whether this was the case. But we know that they never did this. We also know that they didn't try to pick it up, and then conclude that they were off course, because if they had done this, they would have realized that they were off course and they would have corrected for it. So this just leaves us with one possibility. The crew of Flight 7 never checked their position relative to the beacon at St. Paul. Why might this be? Why would a crew, flying long distances over open ocean, fail to do such a simple and mandatory check to confirm that they were on course? There are two concerning possibilities here: negligence or perhaps worse. There is the possibility that the crew never intended to follow the flight plan. Within a few minutes, Flight 7 had crossed the international dateline, and with that, into Soviet airspace. It was now September 1st, 1983. A few hundred miles ahead of Flight 7, the Soviets had gone into panic stations, the headcart site of the U.S. biplane, on radar circling to the east of the Kamchatka Peninsula. This was not the first time in recent weeks that they had spotted a U.S. biplane in their airspace. In fact, just recently, many high-ranking Soviet commanders had been fired for failing to shoot down infringing aircraft before they got away on this night. The commanders at Kamchatka were determined not to let this happen. To them, in the cockpit of Flight 7, the alert button on the ions flashed orange, indicating that the plane had passed its next waypoint, Neva. The way the INS works, this flash happens not when the plane reaches the waypoint, but rather when it comes closest to it on its route. This meant that the flashing light alone was not confirmation that the plane was on course. However, through years of normal use, this was how the pilots of Flight 7 interpreted it. The pilots' manuals specified that when this light flashed, signifying that they had passed a waypoint, they should carry out a number of checks to confirm their position. This included plotting their present position on a chart. It also involved checking any radio beacons within range, and it involved confirming that the plane turned as expected towards the next waypoint on its route. If the pilots had carried out any of these checks, they would have seen that they were way off course. In fact, by now, there were already 160 nautical miles north of where they should have been, or about 300 kilometers. If they had plotted their coordinates on a map, they would have seen that this planted them squarely inside forbidden airspace. They were now flying through a buffer zone between U.S. and Soviet airspace. This buffer zone was off limits to civilian aircraft, and what's worse, if the pilots kept flying, they would soon end up in Soviet airspace. This was a terrifying prospect. Just 5 years previously, another Korean Airlines passenger jet had strayed off course into Soviet airspace and was shot down over northern Russia. Incredibly, that aircraft met a fortunate end, landing safely on a frozen lake, with all but 2 of the passengers surviving the ordeal. But there was no guarantee that things would go so well on this night. Not least because right at that very second, Soviet radar installations on Kamchatka had caught sight of Flight 7 on radar, as the 269 passengers and crew on board Flight 7 cruised through the skies above the Pacific. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were now being watched closely on Soviet military radar. They also didn't know that just 10 minutes flying time after their right-hand side, a U.S. spy plane was circling, gathering intelligence about an enemy, which they were now about to inadvertently overfly. The Soviets were tracking both of these aircraft and had previously identified the U.S. biplane correctly as an RC-135. It struck them as odd, however, that the second plane was being so daring. Rather than circling just within range of the peninsula, it appeared to be heading straight forward. Its altitude and speed were constant too. Whatever this plane was, it apparently wasn't concerned about the possibility of being intercepted, and is Flight 7 near the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's exactly what happened. Soviet commanders scrambled 4 fighter jets to intercept the plane. They took to the skies and immediately began racing towards the wayward aircraft in the cockpit of the Korean Airlines jumbo. The pilots continued on, talking as normal, both amongst themselves and to their colleagues on Flight 15. They were oblivious to the fact that there were hundreds of miles from where they thought they were deep within Soviet airspace. As this was happening, fighter jets were being vectored by Soviet ground control at lightning speed towards the mystery. Intruder fighter jets are fast, But commercial aircraft are fast too, and Flight 7 was traveling at over 80%. The speed of sound, the race was truly on. Would the fighter jets be able to reach the aircraft before it slipped back into international waters, or would Flight 7 end up in a fireball over the Kamchatka Peninsula? After being mistaken for a spy plane, the pilots didn't know it, but as they sat there talking in the warm cocoon of the cockpit, they were racing towards an international border which was their salvation. The Soviet fighter jet sped closer and closer, but just as they were beginning to close in the wayward flight, they ran out of fuel. Reluctantly, they turned around and returned to base. Flight 7 blissfully crossed back into international waters, none the wiser about how close it had come to disaster. Not long after, the plane was out of range of Soviet radar too, and once again, its true position over planet Earth was unknown to anyone outside, or indeed anyone on board. But ignorance wouldn't be bliss for long. A few hundred miles ahead of the flight, on the island of Sakhalin, the Soviets were waiting there. Kumchek and comrades had alerted them to the presence of a mystery intruder heading southwest. Towards their position, the flight was still outside of radar range of Sakhalin Island, but the Soviets began preparing this time. They wouldn't miss their chance on board Flight 7. The pilots still had some time to notice their incredible error, but for that to happen, something would have to alert them to one of the many anomalies appearing on their in-screens. At this point, the pilots were transferred from Anchorage Air Traffic Control to Tokyo Control. They told Tokyo that they had just passed the waypoint Nippy at 5 GMT, and that they were expecting to reach their next waypoint Noka at 6. Tokyo Air Traffic Control acknowledged their message. All appeared normal on the flight deck. The crew were in range of Tokyo Air Traffic Control, so they no longer needed their colleagues to act as a relay. The coordinates on the ions were still showing the plane to be well off course, but unless the pilots actually plotted these coordinates on a map, they were unlikely to notice. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders on the island of Sakhalin had been told that there had been a border violation over Kamchatka, and that what was probably a US or C-135 was now 500 kilometers from their position, flying towards the island on a heading of 240. The commanders waited eagerly for the target to appear on their radar, and at 5:45 p.m. GMT, that's exactly what happened. A blip appeared matching the description given by the officers at Kamchatka, altitude 9,000 meters, speed 800 kilometers per hour. Some officers speculated that this could be a civilian aircraft, or even a Soviet jet, which was out of radio contact. After all, what spy plane in its right mind would fly in a straight line at a constant altitude and speed for hours on end? Was this some kind of bluff? At the same time, other officers contended that there was no way it could be a civilian aircraft. It was over 500 kilometers from the nearest passenger air route, and it had entered their airspace in the same place where a known U.S. biplane was orbiting. But in truth, there was only one way to identify the mystery aircraft. The Soviets put 2 fighter jets at the ready. When the time came, they would scramble these jets and track down the intruding aircraft, and they would have to identify it fast before it got away a second time. Their careers were depending on it. Back on Flight 7, much more than careers were at stake, but the crew were as oblivious as ever. The flight attendants made an announcement to the passengers. They would be landed in Seoul in 3 hours, and would shortly be coming around the cabin with beverages and breakfast. Meanwhile, the pilots continued chatting with the crew of Flight 15. We have a pleasant here's giving us a little fun. Well, after arrival. And Seoul, it's better for you to study all those things. Sorry. What, there's nothing to be studied, by the way. What a good season, it's awesome. I hope I could take a day off for autumn leaves viewing. Make a schedule. Why don't you take some time off and go to Sorak Mountain? Are you about 3 minutes ahead of us throughout their journey? The crew of Flight 7 had had ample opportunity to notice the deviation in their flight path. There were several anomalies, from poor radio signals with Anchorage Air Traffic Control to waypoints which they seemed to be passing slightly later than expected, but now the crew would get one more sign that something was off during their casual conversation with their colleagues on Flight 15. They exchanged information on the winds which they were experiencing. Which direction? Which direction? 0, 4, 0, 0, 4, 0. 30 degrees, 30 knots, 30 and 40 degrees. Direction 35 knots, so, you got so much, we still got headwind. 215 degrees, 15 knots. These aircraft were supposedly just 3 minutes apart, and yet one had a headwind while the other had a tailwind. This was a significant piece of information, which should have alerted both crews to the possibility that something was amiss. What was more likely that the wind would change so much in the space of just a few miles, or that one of the fights was not where it was supposed to be the pilots. A Flight 15 pointed out that, according to the flight plan, the winds should be closer to what they were experiencing, 15 knots approximately. Well, it may be like this. Well, it may be like this. These words are a perfect demonstration of the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, and specifically of the related effect of belief perseverance. This is the tendency to persist in your beliefs even when there is mounting evidence that they're wrong. For the whole journey, the crew of Flight 7 believed that they were on course. That was their reality, when their colleagues, who were apparently just a few miles ahead of them, reported an anomaly that they were experiencing much different winds than Flight 7 was the crew's natural response. Therefore, was to wave it off as just one of those things that happens. Well, it may be like this. Of course, the horrifying reality was that at that very moment, 2 Soviet fighter jets had taken up position behind them. For the first time that night, the Soviets had eyes on the mystery intruder. The pilot of the closer of the 2 jets, known as an interceptor, for obvious reasons reported that it was too dark to make out what kind of aircraft he was tailing. One of the commanders on the ground said that, if it had 4 contrails, then it had to be an RC-135. The commanders were eager not to let the aircraft get away, but at the same time they knew they couldn't shoot the plane down unless it was over the island, and unless they had positively identified. But time was running out. The Soviets began a hurried process to identify the aircraft, but crucially, this entire process was informed by something their colleagues had told them earlier, that this was probably a U.S. biplane. As a result, rather than first treating the plane as a civilian aircraft and trying to call it on the international distress frequency, they immediately began using military interception techniques. This involved using what's known as the friend-foe system, which electronically identifies whether a military aircraft is their own or their enemy's. But naturally, this yielded no response from the mystery aircraft. The interceptor then employed a more threatening technique. He first flashed his lights, which for one thing was useless given that he was well behind the aircraft. And then he fired warning shots in front of the plane, but again something crucial was missing. These warning shots from the plane's cannon were not tracer bullets, which can be clearly seen at night. They were just normal armor-piercing bullets, completely invisible in the nighttime sky, in what can only be described as tragic irony. The Soviets, too, were now beginning to fall prey to confirmation bias. Everything they tried only confirmed their preconceived belief that this intruder was indeed a U.S. spy plate. However, just like the crew of Flight 7, they would be handed one piece of contradictory evidence, which would give them an opportunity to reassess their conclusions. The ground commanders order the pilot of the interceptor to report whether the intruder's navigation lights were on navigation lights, or nav lights are the green and red lights on the wingtips of every plane. No spy plane would leave these lights on if they wanted to remain hidden. If the intruder's nav lights were on, it was quite possible that this mystery aircraft was in fact a wayward passenger jet. Have a look at this transcript from Soviet ground control. It shows the sheer confusion and panic among the commanders as the intruding aircraft began flying over the island. There was chaos as the officers made hurried and half-hearted attempts to identify the aircraft before it re-entered international waters, and amidst all of this confusion, the order was given. The interceptor pilot was to shoot down the intruder in the cabin of Flight 7. The passengers tried to catch a final bit of sleep before breakfast. The soothing hum of the engines had been a constant companion for the entire journey. But now all of this would change. Open the cockpit, the pilots had been cleared by air traffic control to climb to flight level 370. 2,000 feet above their current altitude. They dialed this into the autopilot and began climbing, and as the plane went uphill, it slowed down the interceptor, which had been trailing. The plane zoomed past it, unable to slow down in time. The fighter pilot immediately interpreted this as an evasive maneuver. By the plane aimed at putting him in the path of its weapons on the ground. The commanders were at their wits' end. They had to act now before the plane got away in mere seconds. It would coast out into international waters. The oblivious calm on board Flight 7 was now about to come to an end. The pilot of the interceptor jet pressed the button. 2 seconds later, he pressed it again in the cabin. All hell broke loose. Missile fragments had punctured the aircraft's skin in dozens of places, and the pressurized air inside began rushing out. The pilots were dumbstruck. Immediately, they tried to take stock of what had happened. The flight engineer confirmed that all 4 engines were working normally. Whatever had exploded, it wasn't an engine. Maybe this was an explosive decompression. Neither the flight crew nor anybody else on board knew that they had been hit by a missile. They still thought that they were on course towards Seoul, en route Romeo 2 Nero. Within seconds of the missile strike, the plane entered a rapid climb. The autopilot was still engaged, but it was unable to pitch the plane's nose down. This was because the hydraulic system which powered the elevators on the tailplane had been taken out by the missile, and that was far from the only problem. Just 11 seconds after the fuselage had been breached by the missile fragments, enough air had escaped from the cabin that the passenger oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in the cockpit. The pilots quickly put on their oxygen masks and disengaged the autopilot the captain tried to force the nose of the plane down, but it was no good. 3 of the aircraft's 4 hydraulic systems had lost pressure, having been severed by the missile. The pilots were now trapped in an out-of-control aircraft which was screaming upwards at a frightening pace. If it kept climbing like this, it would soon lose enough speed that it would stall and begin falling back to Earth as all of this was happening. The Soviet commanders frantically tried to ascertain the status of the intruder aircraft. The fighter pilot who fired the missiles reported that the target had been destroyed. Its exterior lights had gone out now, and it was flying erratically. However, the ground commanders could still see the plane on the radar. They urged the second fighter jet to close in and finish the job with its cannons in the cockpit of Flight 7. The pilots were still oblivious to the fact that their plane was not dying of natural causes. 40 seconds after the missile strike, the plane reached an altitude of 38,000 feet before finally dipping its nose and entering a rapid descent. The first officer radioed Tokyo Air Traffic Control, telling them that they were experiencing a rapid decompression and that they were attempting to descend to 10,000 feet. The pilots tried desperately to regain some control on the way down, even managing to slow their descent as the plane fell. But ultimately, the 747 was too crippled to be controllable. 104 seconds after impact, both of the plane's black boxes stopped, recording. Nobody knows exactly what happened on board the plane. After this point, all that's known for sure is that it continued descending in a left-hand spiral until it finally hit the sea. 6 minutes later, none of the 269 passengers and crew survived at the time of missile impact. Flight 7 was 650 kilometers off course in the days that followed. Despite the USSR's best efforts, it became increasingly clear to the world that Korean Airlines Flight 7 had been shot down in a chilling case of mistaken identity amidst the political firestorm, which erupted after the shoot-down. One question appeared impossible to answer. Why had a modern aircraft like the Boeing 747-200 operated by an experienced flight crew strayed so horribly off course? And furthermore, why hadn't any of the pilots noticed? As it turns out, it's still not agreed why Flight 7 went off course. The report into this incident, published in 1993 by the International Civil Aviation Organization, contains differing explanations of the navigation error. In many parts, it supports what is today the most accepted theory, that the pirates left the aircraft in heading mode after being cleared to the Bethel beacon shortly after takeoff and simply forgot to put it into NAV mode for the rest of the flight. But at the end of the report, there is a rejection of this theory, owing to the sheer improbability that the flight crew would have abandoned their duties for such a long duration. It says that the crew's actions, quote, cannot be explained by an insufficient professional level of crew training and attention, or even negligence, since in this case what one is talking about is the complete refusal of the crew to comply with all the rules and procedures for the performance of the flight prescribed by the airline's instructions, including those in the event of possible abnormalities in the operation of the equipment. This section of the report goes on to put forward an entirely different theory, that the pilots actually intended to fight the route that they ended up flying. How could this be? Well, it turns out that the route the pilots flew was almost a direct line between Anchorage and the Seoul Flight Information Region, or basically Seoul's airspace. It's possible, therefore, that when the pilots set up their INS computers on the ground, they didn't program in the route in the flight plan, which included 10 different waypoints, but rather they simply put the coordinates for Seoul's airspace in the INS and put the plane on a direct route there. This direct route matched the plane's actual route to within about 15 nautical miles, and it explains the pilots' lack of curiosity about all of the anomalies they experienced en route, including the differing winds reported by their colleagues on Flight 15. While this too is a gross abdication of their duty, navigation in the 1980s was not as precise a business as it is these days, and nor was pilots' adherence to standard operating procedures, but for what it's worth, which may be something, this theory was proposed by the Russian Federation. The international consensus is that the pilots simply left the plane in heading mode. It is also recognized that the Soviets' attempts to identify the aircraft were grossly inadequate if they had applied the international standards for intercepting passenger aircraft. They would very likely not have shot down the plane, despite the senselessness of this accident. Its impact in aviation has been substantial. Nowadays, navigation methods are far more sophisticated, with GPS greatly enhancing pilots' navigation accuracy and their situational awareness. In fact, it was this very crash which spurred Ronald Reagan to make GPS technology available for use by commercial air transport, rather than just for the military. Modern cockpits also have much better visual reminders of which mode the autopilot is in, so the pilots are always in the loop as to what their autopilot is doing. These changes come as little consolation to the families of those who died on board Flight 7, but they have made flying that much safer for all of us today. If you found this video interesting, press the like button to support the channel. It tells YouTube to show the video to more people. And as always, a huge thanks to the patrons for making this video possible. Their names are showing up on screen now, and you can join them and get early access to new videos as well as completely ad-free videos by clicking on this box which I've put on the screen here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.